Donald Trump could tank the Canadian economy, but Justin Trudeau cares too much about abortion to try diplomacy. Now, the hostilities between President-elect Donald Trump and Justin Trudeau have been heating up again, and the reason I say heating up is because, as many of you will remember, they didn't have so cordial of a relationship during Donald Trump's first term, even though there was a lot of negotiations going on between the Canadian government and the American government. And for a number of reasons, Justin Trudeau has decided to target Donald Trump almost constantly. He's almost in many cases tried to run in Canada as sort of a blue state governor and run against an American populist movement rather than actually run in Canada against the federal Conservative Party. So just for a bit of background on this, in a bid to head off Trump's threat of massive 25% tariffs, Trudeau flew to Mar-a-Lago last month to kiss the ring because he went from constantly trashing Trump to obviously needing Trump to like him, because if Trump follows through with his threat of 25% tariffs, then many sectors of the Canadian economy are going to be in very enormous trouble overnight. And press reported that during the dinner, Trump reportedly joked that Canada should become America's 51st state. And as Trump does, when he tells a joke that he likes and is really taken with it, he starts to repeat that joke over and over and over again. And so during an NBC interview, he again repeated the same joke that Canada should be the 51st state. And then he was really taken with that reiteration of the joke. And so he actually started posting about it on social media, which is pretty funny unless you're a patriotic Canadian. He said, posting on social media, "It was a pleasure to have dinner the other night with Governor Justin Trudeau of the great state of Canada. I look forward to seeing the governor again soon so that we may continue our in-depth talks on tariffs and trade, the results of what will be truly spectacular for all." Now, this is obviously signature Trump trolling. It's an obvious joke with a bit of a sting in the tail. And there are a couple of reasons that Trump is doing this. First, this is just how he does business. He throws his weight around. He intimidates people. It's basically a power play. If you've read anything Trump has written, and his books are a slog, but he talks about this in his books like The Art of the Deal. You throw your weight around, you show people your cards, and at Mar-a-Lago, Trump was basically showing Trudeau that he pretty much has all the cards, and Trudeau doesn't have any of them. And no doubt this joke was really aggravating, and it's obviously intended to be. And one of the reasons that it's so aggravating is, of course, Trudeau and his team have to publicly pretend like it isn't aggravating, and that actually it was LOL, very funny. And in fact, one member of Trudeau's team insisted that their back and forth was evident of mutual respect and warmth, which is genuinely hilarious because Trudeau and Trump do not have a relationship of either mutual respect or warmth. And everybody knows that. So when you force your opponent to suck up your insults and then lie about those insults and actually claim they were compliments, there's something about that I'm sure Trump really enjoys doing, especially to an ideological opponent like Justin Trudeau. There's definitely an element of revenge to this, because one of Trudeau's signature smears, or maybe I should say sneers, when attacking socially conservative Canadians in particular, such as parental rights protesters, is to insist that either they're bigots or victims of far-right American disinformation. This is one of Trudeau's favorite lines of attack when people point out the kinds of things that are going on in Canada. And Trudeau's also gone to great lengths to label the federal Conservative Party leader Pierre Poilievre as MAGA conservatives. This is a phrase used by most liberal parliamentarians, by a number of cabinet ministers. Trudeau himself has used the phrase. And when they say MAGA conservatives, they don't mean it as a compliment. And I'm going to bet that using Trump's signature phrase constantly as an insult didn't do Trudeau a lot of favors in the eyes of the MAGA team currently headed towards the White House. And in the context of Trump's previous statements about Trudeau, his jokes actually do seem like something of a deliberate humiliation. He's previously referred to Trudeau respectfully and warmly, his team would no doubt insist, as weak and a far-left lunatic. Trump was also very unenthused by Trudeau's comment that he and other world leaders had managed Mr. Trump during his first term. And there's definitely not going to be any managing him during his second term, which fortunately for all of us is likely to outlast Trudeau's tenure at 24 Sussex. And thankfully for all Canadians, and all Americans for that matter, we're likely to have a new prime minister sometime next year. But this tense relationship puts conservative and socially conservative Canadians in a really interesting position. Because on one hand, there's something very enjoyable. There's a lot of schadenfreude in seeing Trudeau be put in his place, because Trudeau has infamously, ironclad arrogance and very unearned arrogance. Nobody thinks more of Justin Trudeau than Justin Trudeau. I'm sure he's the kind of person who admires himself in the mirror every single morning. And so for him to have to suck up insults from somebody that he's not only insulted, but somebody who has also been used as a way of smearing his ideological opponents must really, really hurt. But here's what's crazy. It's not surprising that Justin Trudeau has, over the past several years, gone out of his way to insult President Donald Trump. Justin Trudeau is an incredibly left-wing progressive. Donald Trump is ideologically promiscuous, but it's fair to say that he's much further to the right than Justin Trudeau is. And of course, a lot of things about Donald Trump offend Trudeau's sensibilities. And in fact, I suspect the only two things the men have in common are their sexually revolutionary values when it comes to their personal lives. But what I think is really indicative here is that when we're looking at the relationship between Trump and Trudeau, we have a prime minister who is actually responsible for negotiating with Donald Trump to protect the Canadian economy. Trump knows this. I suspect he's probably not willing to let Trudeau off the hook very easily. He probably knows that he's not going to have to deal with Trudeau for much longer. And Trump probably sees no reason to give somebody he doesn't like a win. But to add to this, I started this segment by pointing out that Justin Trudeau cares more about abortion, cares more about his alleged feminism than he cares about the Canadian economy. So he just flew down to Mar-a-Lago to kiss the ring. He portrayed Trump's playful insults as evidence of warmth and evidence of a good relationship. And then he did this.
Now, it shouldn't be that way. It wasn't supposed to be that way. We were supposed to be on a steady, if difficult sometimes, march towards progress. And yet, just a few weeks ago, the United States voted for a second time to not elect its first woman president. Everywhere, women's rights and women's progress is under attack, overtly and subtly. But I want you to know that I am, and always will be, a proud feminist. You will always have an ally in me and in my government.
Just to give that clip some context, Justin Trudeau was actually speaking on, let me check the date for a second, it was December 10. He was speaking at an event hosted by the Equal Voice Foundation, which is an organization dedicated to improving gender representation in Canadian politics. And essentially, Trudeau decried the election of the man that he is going to have to negotiate with to ensure that 25% tariffs don't cripple Canada's economy. He just can't help himself. Now, Trudeau, of course, is the sort of feminist that gets caught groping a journalist, and then when the journalist confirms that she has been groped, says that he doesn't remember that, but they must have experienced it differently, which of course is true, because the experience of groping and the experience of being groped are very, very different. So Trudeau is that kind of feminist. He's also the kind of anti-racist who is the first Canadian prime minister on historical record to have used blackface so many times, he can't remember how many times he used it. So that's the kind of guy who's here now talking about his feminist credentials, his progressive credentials. But even though this is his normal shtick, he could have easily given a speech at the Equal Voice Foundation where he did what he always does, which is rave on about abortion rights, rave on about his equal split cabinet, to rave on about how he's a feminist. But instead, no, he has to essentially condemn the American people for refusing to vote for Kamala Harris and instead electing Donald Trump, the very man he is supposed to negotiate with and to essentially at this point plead with not to impose massive economy-crushing tariffs on Canada. What's the conclusion to all of this? Again, Justin Trudeau prioritizes abortion, prioritizes his faux feminism above and beyond anything else. It also just affirms once again that in many ways Canada is just the vanity project of this raging narcissist who doesn't really care about Canada at all. In fact, Matt Gurney, who was formerly of the National Post, now of The Line, said on Twitter the other day, Trudeau's not going to be able to resist running against Trump in the next election. And I think he's probably right. He ran the last election on demonizing the unvaccinated and on essentially politicizing the issue of vaccination, because he didn't really care about the vaccination or those who were unvaccinated. He just thought that he could pit one segment of the Canadian population against another and eke out a majority government by doing so. And he now, even if he has to threaten the Canadian economy, I can easily see Matt Gurney being correct and him running an entire election campaign against the very man who currently holds the axe over the heads of a lot of Canadian industries. So we'll see how that goes, but this is just a reminder again that abortion is pretty much the only thing Trudeau has ever been loyal to. The Premier of Quebec is threatening to ban prayer in all public spaces. Now, secularism in Quebec is incredibly aggressive and has been since the Quiet Revolution. Quebec was once Canada's most universally religious provinces. The Catholic Church ruled almost every single aspect of life in that province. It was very similar to the Republic of Ireland in that way. But it all collapsed during the 1950s and the early 1960s. And since then, Quebec has become, in a very strange way, the most identitarian province, and that it treasures its identity the most highly and rigorously defends it through all sorts of absurd French language laws, and at the same time, rigidly secular. So an identitarian province that is kind of rooted on the premise of rejecting its previous identity, the identity that it held for centuries, which of course is Roman Catholicism in particular and Christianity in general. And so this news came out last week. Quebec Premier François Legault publicly vowed to put a stop to praying in all public spaces. And he was very, very broad about where he said prayer would be banned. So this isn't just your run-of-the-mill secular state ban on prayer in schools. The schools right across Canada used to open with the Lord's Prayer, with other prayers. They don't now. Prayer is actually banned in schools. But now the Premier says that he would actually like to ban prayer in parks and on city streets. And we already have one Catholic bishop coming out and pointing out this would affect a wide range of activities practiced by people of many faiths, including festivals and things like that. There's plenty of events that include prayer, including Remembrance Day, which isn't so much of a thing in Quebec to begin with. But, of course, Federal Immigration Minister, side note here, Federal Immigration Minister Mark Miller accused Legault of picking on Muslims immediately. Of course, well, people can't pray in public. What are the Muslims going to do? They must be allowed to pray in public, as opposed to the fact, this is very obviously an attack in many ways on Christian heritage. There are a lot of Catholic processions, and there's a lot of outdoor praying that goes on at various Christian events. But of course, the federal government isn't interested in defending Christians from anti-religious bigotry, just like they're more interested in combating Islamophobia than putting a stop to the church burnings happening across the country. But that's just a sidebar. Now, the premier's promise could really have some teeth, because he's already threatened to use the notwithstanding clause to ban prayer. That means that he could pass a ban on public prayer, and then if that ban was overturned by the courts, he could use the notwithstanding clause of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms to say, notwithstanding this court's ruling, the provincial legislature will uphold this law regardless. And his comments kind of came out of nowhere. These comments were made a couple of weeks ago on the last day of the fall legislative session, and he was actually reacting to a La Presse report. La Presse is a Quebec media outlet that a high school north of Montreal was allowing praying in the classrooms and hallways, and he's the sort of bigot who says praying in hallways and classrooms. Somebody must put a stop to this. He also pinpointed prayers that were taking place from Muslim immigrants, which this is the really unique form, again, of Quebec identitarianism that's so confusing for many people to figure out, is on one hand, Quebec is very identitarian, wants to preserve their unique Quebecois heritage, which of course is inextricably tied with Catholicism. And on the other hand, they don't believe any of that stuff. They are the most pro-abortion province in Canada. They have one of the highest abortion rates in Canada. They have the highest rate, for example, of third abortions in the country. But when you see religious symbolism that's Islamic or Sikh or Hindu, they particularly can't stand that. It's kind of like, well, if we want to have Catholic trappings, that's one thing, because like that's the religion that we don't believe in, but it's still ours. Whereas these people are different. So there's a lot going on there. It's kind of difficult to understand Quebec in a lot of ways, but we'll see what happens with this. It's just another attempt, of course, to drive religion out of the public square entirely. They've already invoked the notwithstanding clause twice since taking power, and once was in 2019 to pass Quebec's secularism law that bans certain civil servants from wearing religious symbols in the workplace, and then they used it again in 2021 when the provincial government tabled Bill 96 to limit the use of English in certain situations. So both of these bills were allegedly to protect the unique Quebec identity, but now secularism is the new unique identity, despite the fact that even the landscape of Quebec has been shaped very much by the Catholic Church. So we'll see what happens with this, but it's just another indication. The fact that we're talking about banning prayer in public, not just in government institutions, not just in federal or provincial government buildings, but we're actually talking about banning prayer in public parks and streets. It's just another giant step forward to attempting to erase all forms of faith from the public square. And we'll keep an eye on this story and report to you more as it develops, as I'm sure that it will. The UK has introduced a permanent ban on puberty blockers for those under 18. Now, of course, if puberty blockers are banned for those who are under the age of 18, they might as well be banned, because the intention of puberty blockers or cross-sex hormones is to pause puberty, according to trans activists. But it has devastating side effects because you cannot pause puberty, and have been proven to be incredibly dangerous for children. Now, what is so significant about this story? It's the first country that's putting a straight up blanket ban on puberty blockers for minors, full stop. Really important. This subject is being debated in almost every Western country. So the Cass Review, which I've mentioned before on the show, the Cass Review was a study of the use of puberty blockers and other transgender treatments that was initiated by the National Health Service, the NHS, and led by Dr. Hilary Cass. And it found that there was no evidence puberty blockers worked. There was no evidence that cross-sex hormones worked, and that, in fact, many of the treatments, so-called, that trans activists were advising had genuinely negative effects, which some people like Abigail Schreier and others have been screaming bloody murder about already for years. But this was the health service of a major Western country, in many ways the mother democracy for other Anglosphere countries, saying, no, these things are bad, we're putting a stop to it. Those arguments laid out in the Cass Review have already been cited in a recent U.S. Supreme Court discussion about whether or not individual state-level bans on puberty blockers or sex change surgeries for minors could be upheld. So we're already seeing that study being used by Supreme Court justices to argue that these treatments can also be banned in the U.S. And then, of course, currently in Alberta, right now, 3 laws restricting various transgender aspects of transgender ideology, have passed the legislature. LGBT activists are already suing the Alberta government and are actually asking the court to fast track their case in order to put a halt to the legislation, because Premier Danielle Smith, as promised, has also brought forward a ban on puberty blockers and sex change surgeries for minors. So here's how the BBC described this very groundbreaking news. The title of the article is "Puberty Blockers for Under 18s Banned Indefinitely." And here, this is from the British Broadcasting Service. The ban on giving puberty blockers to under 18s questioning their gender identity is to be made permanent, Health Secretary Wes Streeting has announced. Streeting told MPs that he was making the temporary ban introduced in May indefinite across the UK, following a consultation and advice from the Commission on Human Medicines, calling the way that drugs has been used a scandal. Some of us have been saying this for years. The expert group said prescribing the drugs to children for gender dysphoria was a, quote, unacceptable safety risk. Now, LGBT activists in Canada are currently claiming that it's an unacceptable safety risk to ban puberty blockers. Here you have the UK Health Secretary stating the exact opposite. And it's important to note here that Wes Streeting is the health minister for a Labour government. The Labour Party of the UK is a very left-wing party. They are very pro-LGBT in almost every way, and they're pretty much as left-wing as Trudeau's government, although Trudeau's government is more like a comms department that occasionally governs, so that might be an unfair comparison to the Labour Party. Campaigners on both sides have reacted to the news, with those in support of the ban commending Streeting's integrity and those against it calling it discrimination, the usual garbage. Puberty blockers are drugs used to delay or prevent puberty happening. A temporary ban was put in place by the last Conservative government and has now been renewed twice by Streeting, who I reemphasize is from the Labour Party. He said on Monday that the review identified cases where children had been prescribed the treatment after filling out an online form and only having one online consultation with a healthcare provider. The health secretary said it was essential for the government to be evidence-led when it came to healthcare. What a refreshing concept. And the reason that, again, the story is so significant is, again, UK is kind of the mother democracy, right? In Canada, we share the same monarch as the UK. And the UK was also ahead of the curve on the transgender issue. They went the craziest, the fastest. And so to see them turn this corner is an indication of where we're going to end up. And so this is both encouraging for those of us who have been pushing back against this for years to keep it up. It's actually making a difference. Secondarily, though, it's a warning to all those who, in the face of all of this evidence coming out, evidence coming from places like the Cass Review, that they like to talk about the wrong side of history, they are going to have the greatest medical scandal since eugenics hung around their neck when this thing is over. And every child who suffers side effects, who has a shortened lifespan, who has weakened bones, who has chest scars where breasts should be, who has a mutilated private area where healthy genitals should be, these kids and their pain should be laid at the feet of the activists right now who are campaigning against the Alberta government, who are campaigning against those politicians seeking to protect them. There is no excuse for this ignorance. It is only radicalism, and that is it. But we are, I think, starting to see a corner get turned here because there is too much evidence for people to deny. This has now been affirmed twice by a Labour government. It's been affirmed by the High Court. You've had top psychiatric experts in the UK come out and actually say the trans movement is irresponsible with how they talk about this issue because the way they talk about suicidal ideation is actually likely to cause suicidal ideation. So this is really big news and really positive news for Premier Danielle Smith in Alberta and for other premiers who are hopefully going to be as courageous as Danielle Smith was and follow her lead. The tragic story of OnlyFans performer Lily Phillips is another reminder that there is not a single good reason not to ban pornography. Now, for those of you unfortunate enough to come across this story, the only reason I'm commenting on a story like this with such specifics is because it's been covered by every single major media outlet, mainstream media. It's been covered by most of the major podcasts, etc., and it's gone viral across social media. It's gone viral on X. It's gone viral on YouTube. So Lily Phillips, basically did a stunt where as an OnlyFans performer, which is essentially a form of personalized, it's a personalized pornography service where girls use a webcam, they get subscribers, and then they communicate with their subscribers and they perform various sex acts and do things like that in exchange for money. So it's basically like prostitution, but on video. And she did this shtick where she promised to sleep with 100 men in a single day in a London Airbnb. And there was a documentary done about this. And there's a clip of her talking to filmmaker Joshua Peters just after she finished breaking this world record. She slept actually with 101 men in a single day. And here is what that clip looks like.
I think sometimes like feeling so like robotic, like by the 30th, like when we're getting on a bit, I've got like a routine of like how we're going to do this. And like, it just, sometimes you'd like disassociate and be like, like it's not like normal sex at all. In my head right now, I can think of like 5, 6 guys, 10 guys that I remember, and that's it. But it's just, I don't know, it's just weird, isn't it? Like, if I didn't have the videos, I wouldn't have known I've done 100, you know? But yeah. I think that was kind of the hard part, is like conversing with them, and like when they'd kind of be like, oh, like we've only had 2 minutes or 3 minutes and you said 5 on the message.
Did someone say that to you?
Yeah. And obviously it just makes me feel so bad.
Do you think you should feel bad about that?
I guess when you've promised something to people who support you, it's kind of hard to let them down.
But it's up to you, right? Like when you know.
Yeah.
Have you even processed, do you think, what's happened?
Not yet. I won't forget the stage.
When I decided to start making this documentary, I wasn't too sure of what to expect. I certainly didn't expect to see Lily so upset at the end of it all.
Peter goes on to say that, I thought perhaps in years to come she might look back on this day in sadness, but not so instantly afterwards. And this video is heartbreaking for a lot of reasons. There's been a ton of responses to this again. I think that a lot of people are emphasizing that there is still grace and healing for people like Lily Phillips, which is of course obviously true. Others are pointing out also truthfully that this is sort of the logical end of what the sexual revolution looks like when you replace any standard of morality for sexuality with just a very simple standard of consent and not discuss what consent actually is or what it looks like. But there's another point here I think that's worth looking at. Phillips, again, is employed as an OnlyFans creator, and she was the subject of this documentary titled I Slept with 100 Men in One Day. And as you just saw, at the end of that, she looked very, very devastated. And as Lois McLatchy Miller, who is the spokeswoman for ADF International, observed, she's responsible for her own behavior in this sick stunt. It's also clear that OnlyFans have turned women into plastic dolls, and the models themselves have brought this heartbreaking lie. And this is a point I want to zero in on, because this video, this horrifying stunt that Miller pulled, is the logical conclusion of where the porn industry takes us. A porn industry that many people participate in, that even many of you may participate in, and that we need to recognize as a force for tremendous evil. This video isn't just some extreme aberration. It is the logical conclusion both of the sexual revolution, but of the porn industry in particular. The majority of Westerners now consume pornography regularly. Like I've said before, in mid-2020, Pornhub was getting 4.5 trillion clicks monthly, which is exceeding the traffic of both Google and Facebook combined. And much of that content features the abuse of women. One consequence of nations filled with porn addicts is that the content has to become more and more extreme as users crave new material. The porn industry drives porn addiction, but it's also a feedback loop as porn addicts also drive the porn industry with their need for increasingly perverse material to feed their addiction. Let me quote for you from an article explaining why looking at pornography and then getting addicted to pornography drives this need for new and more perverse content. Quote, experiencing new things triggers dopamine, making us feel good. Porn provides a never-ending display of novelty. Novelty is strongly associated with overconsumption. Extra excitement activities strengthen brain circuits, urging repeated use. Over time, the brain learns that porn is a reliable way to encounter novel images and seek good feelings. Each new stimulus gives an incentive to explore more, and this rush creates the anticipation of a reward, and the addiction cycle is born. Dr. Emra Dazul from the Institute of Cognitive Neuroscience at UCL says, when we see something new, we see it has a potential for rewarding us in some way. This potential that lies in new things motivates us to explore our environment for rewards. The brain learns that stimulus, once familiar, has no reward associated with it, and so it loses its potential. And for this reason, only completely new objects activate the midbrain area and increase our levels of dopamine. Pornography supplies endless novelty. Or to reword this a different way, we need pornography to be endlessly novel in order for pornography to still work. If you're addicted to pornography, the stuff you started looking at will not arouse you anymore a year later, maybe even 6 months later. And so you're going to need to see increasingly extreme things in order to still find pornography arousing, to still get that dopamine rush. I have talked to countless porn addicts who said one day they woke up one day and were just stunned by the kinds of things that they were watching and the kinds of things they enjoyed watching. And they didn't realize how pornography had essentially metastasized their sexual tastes until they were looking at things that physically disgusted them and yet also compelled them when it should have repelled them. Now, interestingly enough, some have lauded the creation of OnlyFans as a step closer to eliminating abuse in the porn industry. Obviously, pornography is inherently wrong. It's not just wrong because it fuels abuse. It's inherently wrong because it's an offense against the dignity of the human person created in God's image. OnlyFans is a subscriber-based platform that allows women to prostitute themselves online, and it cuts out, of course, the industry executives and porn sets and allows performers to sell their work directly to a subscriber base. So they're essentially self-employed and the direct financial beneficiaries of their work. And just so you know, the platform is wildly popular now. OnlyFans has 305 million fans and 4.1 million accounts. And in 2023, the number of user accounts increased by 28%, and the number of creator accounts increased by 29%. But those who hoped OnlyFans would decrease the abuse in the industry were obviously wrong, because we are now in an increasingly, if not entirely, pornified society. And OnlyFans creators are now voluntarily enslaving themselves to a voracious audience of addicts who constantly crave new and more extreme content, and whose consumption of abusive material has wired their arousal patterns to degradation, humiliation, and destruction, which they now want from whichever OnlyFans creators that they have subscribed to. Now, if these creators want to keep their customers, they must respond to the new demands. And the demands, as with traditional porn sites, are increasingly dark, increasingly degrading, as we saw with this awful, horrifying, tragic stunt pulled by Lily Phillips. Pornography is the celebration of the destruction of the feminine, and millions of people, as a result, will arouse themselves to the sight of a 23-year-old girl degrading herself by being taken by over 100 men. And as we saw in that clip, she will sob afterwards, but ultimately insist that it's worth it. Her viewers, with their lust stoked by her degradation, will sadly agree. Thank you all for watching this episode of the Bridgehead Briefing. If you have any comments or discussions that you'd like to have, please drop those in the comments. If you found the video helpful, you can click like, or you can subscribe to the channel, share it with your friends. You can get our content wherever you find your podcasts. Thank you so much once again for your time. We hope you'll join us again next week.